Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to Why Left.
It's Why Left Part 2. How exciting.
Yeah. So in part one, we talked about the crisis of expertise and autodidacts, the vices that are tendencies in the fields of academia, the vices that are tendencies in the life of the autodidact. And, so I'm coming at this from the standpoint of a person who very easily could have been some kind of an autodidact from my mid 20s till now. I could have been. But because of happenstance and a lot of things that went the way they went, I ended up going to the university. But I went to the university with no formal educational background, no time in any K through 12 institutions. And so I was very out of my element the whole time, yet I was able to excel. And of course, that might have something to do with the fact that the standards have gone down. To be totally honest about that, the standard, it could just be the standards have been lowered to such a point that I was able to excel. Yet I was surrounded by people who obviously were also struggling, yet not able to achieve in the ways that I was able to, say get on the dean's list or into the honors college or whatever, graduate with a 3.9, which I think is more of a testament to my gritted teeth sort of determination and my desire to prove something than it was to anything else. I mean, there were obviously people who were a lot more devoted to X, Y, and Z fields who might have scored lower when it came to exams, or maybe they didn't write essays that were graded as well. But why? At the end of the day, I was there for multiple reasons, and I definitely wanted to get the most that I could from the actual education and get as well acquainted with these fields as I could. But also, I had something to prove in a way that I don't think some other people might have. And so I'm thinking about how even though I had like this huge desire to show, look, a person with no formal background, the first in his family to go to college, I had like this sort of heroic story about it. Um, I could think this story, and how like at the time I think that I had a sort of sense of pride that came with it. Like I'm killing it. I'm doing a really great job. Um, but then in retrospect, I have like these critiques, right? Like and part of that is the humbling process of going through the university. And so on the one side, I was humbled because I did come in contact with some great professors who were able to challenge me and really, you know, uh, they weren't going to just give me the easy way out, right? And they would force me to really step it up, and I would feel stupid frequently, right? Like without those kinds of experiences, I think I would have been less humbled. But as humbled as I was, I still come out the other side with a bit of pride or hubris, perhaps, because the standards have been lowered so much. So, I had to search out professors who would genuinely challenge me in a lot of cases. Uh, Not everyone does. In a lot of cases, the genuine challenge is like, oh, well, you just can't cheat on this biology exam. That doesn't mean that you're really being initiated into the field, right? And so because of that, it's like I am also uh, not holding academia in the highest regard. People who uh, make their appeals to authority somehow couched in the diplomas or expertise that they've acquired in academia. I kind of am like, okay, it's going to take more from you than that because I've seen it from the inside. And in the Sarutu Phase 1 research that we were doing on tour, one of the things that I was surprised by was that the gas station workers and truckers and other kind of working class people that we met across the country tended to hold academia in a higher regard than people who were actually in it. And now the sample data here is terribly skewed. I'm going purely off of uh, a few uh, 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 I'd say like 150 results from Boise State University that included students, faculty, and administration being compared against something like 120 results from across the country. So it's really, really skewed. But the point is like I thought just in my interactions, I was like, oh, well, if students keep assuming that students are here for the wrong reasons, that they're not really here to learn, they're just here for the job coupon and to make friends. Well, then I'm assuming that gas station workers and truckers are going to think even more so that that is the case, right? When it turned out over and over and over again that that was not the case, that a lot of the gas station workers and truckers that I was talking to, they were like, they were assuming that uh, the best and brightest are going to college for the best reasons, that they want to be lifelong learners and they want to contribute or whatever. And so um I was kind of surprised by that. And so I think that my sort of cynical view of the university is probably itself a fallen professional perspective more than it is a working class perspective. So I kind of want to start out with that, is that I think I've brought this into everything I've done at Theory Underground all along. And now that we're talking about the crisis of expertise and of autodidacts, um, I feel like I am uh 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 I am this character in a lot of ways. This person who will take things very personally. I am this person who uh can be difficult to disagree with on X, Y, and Z issues. I'm going to be sensitive. I'm going to take it, but then again, I'm also super self-critical, and I'm welcomed. I welcome all kinds of critiques, but there's certain modes of critique that probably wouldn't bother a lot of other people, that and it does bother me. And then finally, there's this move that you make, Benjamin, and you've done it several times, I think, on this show, but elsewhere as well, where you sort of are, I don't want to say psychoanalyzing, but to use that term loosely, psychoanalyzing the origin story of the autodidact. There must be something that happened in his or her life that makes it so that they are now this autodidact. And whatever it is that happened probably caused them to not get the recognition that they deserved, or that they felt like they should have gotten. And now here they are, they're doing this on their own, and they're very proud of their accomplishments, their perceived accomplishments, that they'll never get the recognition they deserve for having actually achieved, because they don't really belong to any of these communities. And so there's this sort of libidinal um knot or tangle of issues that all go into this. And I feel personally implicated up to a certain point. And so I think that it is worth maybe tarrying with that a little bit. But um, I will in this episode want to segue that into uh, how I'm trying to sort of short circuit that process. And part of that being about uh, this tendency intellectuals in general, not just autodidacts, but just in general, intellectuals have this tendency towards misanthropy, as Judith Shklar talks about in her Ordinary Vices. One of those ordinary vices is misanthropy, this hatred of humanity, but that it's especially strong in the intellectual who feels like they're not getting the respect they deserve from the larger society. So that seems like a problem that she's picking out in the academic class, but at the same time, it's going to be compounded for the autodidact. And so I'm developing uh, forms of praxis for combating the ways we develop these hyper niche, competitive, defensive identities, um, which is all symptomatic of the post-class fractured mass, as well as all these other things that you've laid out. Okay, so I know that's a lot, but that opens the door, I think, for a lot. I'm gonna go refill my coffee while I listen to you. Um, but yeah, what do we want to, what do we want to do with that? Where do we want to go with this?
Yeah, it has me thinking a lot about community. I think misanthropy is a symptom of not being in community. And it can happen a number of different ways. Of course, one would be the autodidact who just doesn't ever get into a community. It never really happens. And then if they try to enter a community, they have to enter it from a position that is kind of entry level. And maybe they feel that what they've done ought to entitle them to more than that. And they're frustrated with the level at which they enter in. At the same time, I also notice this as a problem for academics, because a lot of academics, although they're in an academic community, it's this twisted university community that isn't really a real community in many senses. It doesn't really live up to the idea of a community of knowers with a common knowledge object working together to try to understand that thing. It's a bunch of people competing for jobs and competing to be seen enough, to attract enough research funding, to have enough research impact, to get specific things that they need individually. And the stuff that they're ostensibly there to learn about and study together becomes instrumental to that rather than the purpose of it. And this produces academics who don't really seem to be moving in love for the subject that they are ostensibly committed to. And if they're not moving in love for that subject, then they can't be in community with other people in love for that subject. And I think that part of the way that the university system barbarizes people who often go into it with some kind of deep love for something is by sticking them in this instrumental, pragmatic competition that drives them out of the energy that they would need to be in. So on the one side, you have this kind of Time trying to get status, recognition, love from the other. And on the other side, you have this pragmatic subordination of the object of devotion to a competitive process that's about jobs. And in both cases, this can produce a sense of estrangement from any kind of real community, a sense that the function of other people is to get in the way of you feeling good. You know, the function of other people is to prevent you from getting the things that you think you need to do and be good. So in the case of the autodidact, what other people do is they withhold the recognition that you need. And in the case of the academic, what other people do is they force you to think instrumentally about your object of devotion. So in both cases, what other people do is evil and prevents you from getting what you think you need. But in the case of the autodidact, because the autodidact is still in a kind of honor relation, the real love for the subject has not yet been discovered. That has to be discovered through an arduous process of being tempered through the seeking that the autodidact has not been able to be submitted to. And a question for autodidacts is, can they submit to this? So many autodidacts will go, could I go to the university system? And the could I go is not necessarily an insecurity about, am I smart enough? It's, could I psychologically take the tempering that would involve, which would require me to be humble about something that I have used to try to make myself feel like a person. So it requires you to invert an attitude that you had previously taken up in the service of the thing. And so the real question is, do you actually love the thing enough to humble yourself before it, or is it just a carapace to try to make you feel better about who you are? You know, and then conversely, for the academic, the question is, can you find some way to get out of the instrumentalization of that thing and return to that devotional energy, the energy that first drove you to go into the academy to try to do a PhD? Can you rediscover that or refine that? Is there some sort of institutional framework, some sort of struggle in the institutions or for new institutions that you could engage in that would help you find it? Or are you fated to be just caught continuously in pragma throughout your career, never really actually accessing the thing that you're devoted to? Always, always, always kept away from it by other people, in which case you will inevitably become quite misanthropic.
On the first of those two, the autodidact one, this idea that the autodidact has not truly found the love for the thing yet, because to find the love for the thing requires a kind of devotion that requires submitting. Now, of course, I think we can also say there's probably political and economic factors that go into a lot of people feeling like that horizon is foreclosed to them. Okay. But then on if we just bracket that out, there is the idea of submitting oneself to tutelage, to mastery, right? You submit yourself to a process of apprenticeship, right? And that's something that Theory Underground has tried to model. And in a sort of sense, I probably at this point I could write a book about the different ways that in the last few years I've attempted to model it and have other people model it and do stuff with it. And the reason I'm disillusioned with multiple um, of the approaches that I've taken there, or that I've seen other people try. So it's like what we're getting at is a real problem, um, but also uh, the mastery, the apprenticeship under mastery, um, is not plausibly something that you can submit yourself to. Um, in a lot of cases, right? So when the professors are overworked, uh, and pretty much like inaccessible, or when and this is where we get this is I think the biggest reason that autodidacts that I can think of who are openly hostile towards the idea of submitting to uh, the requirements of an associate's degree. We'll start with the associates because with autodidacts that I can think of who have openly expressed this sort of derision, because obviously I did submit myself to that. But for the people who are expressing this derision, they're saying like, no, uh, I shouldn't have to study a bunch of arbitrary subjects uh, where it's not even like a genuine study of those subjects. It's like this disciplinary process of forcing me to memorize a bunch of arbitrary facts during arbitrary times of the day, which requires me turning away my focus from the subject that I love and instead focusing on a bunch of bureaucratic bullshit. Right? Like so I want to actually devil's advocate here, um, from that position and say that, yeah, I did feel like the entire time I was doing my associates and my bachelor's, I was constantly having to turn away from cultivating a devotion towards the subjects that I felt pulled towards, called towards. And instead, I was doing bureaucratic acrobatics, right? Of this sort of arbitrary uh, stuff where it's like it would be one thing if it was biology for real, but instead it's biology not really in any sort of form, just content. The content is biology, but it's the form is not biology. The form is a disciplinary process of memorization that requires sacrificing my ability to focus my attention on the subject matters that are compelling, interesting, or that I feel passionate about.
Yeah, this is a good point. So the system makes it quite difficult to find a charismatic master that you can submit to. Very much so. The way that the system tries to make up for this, insofar as it does, is submission to a discipline. So when you're submitting to a discipline, you have a number of different people that teach you in a number of different courses that you take. And each of these people gives you a little bit of discipline through the feedback. And then by exposure to lots of different people, each of whom give you a little bit of feedback, each of whom touch you up a little bit, you get disciplined by the discipline in a more abstract sense, as opposed to a particular person who is the master. That kind of relationship, if it can happen, typically will happen at the point at which you're doing a dissertation, and often, not until it's a PhD. Maybe a little bit of it at an earlier stage if you do an undergraduate or a master's thesis, depending on where you go. Now, you're quite right that a lot of schools, these days, especially in the United States, especially the state-run universities, do high school and call that university education. And doing multiple choice memorization stuff, that might be relevant for preparing you for a job in something like medicine, where part of what a doctor does is remember a lot of facts and apply them to specific cases. But that is really not the way to get a proper education in something like theory or a humanities field. So, of course, if you're in a situation where the degree that's in front of you is not really a proper degree, then that would not be the degree that I would advise pursuing. Even if, the most that could be said for something like that is its instrumental value, that it maybe if you did a degree like that, you might then be considered for some further degree at a later point. But now you're having to really spend many years toiling with limited promise of actually getting admitted to some place that will really teach you. Maybe you'll get admitted, or maybe they'll just reject you in 3 years at the end of the, 4 years at the end of the degree. And you'll just have spent a lot of time jumping through bureaucratic hoops, and nobody will ever properly teach you. That is a legitimate concern with many of these universities. I would not, tell people to just go to a program that's really about trying to equip people with job skills so that they can be repurposed and put back into the workforce in a different social role. I wouldn't do that to try to follow a discipline. Of course, the expense and the difficulty of finding a school that really will do this, potentially goes up once you commit yourself very seriously to finding a place that really will give you a proper education from the start. In my own case, in the British university system, there are a lot of schools that will allow you to write essays, that will not ask you multiple choice, true, false, those kinds of silly exams, won't do that kind of stuff, and will really give you an opportunity to express at some length, your ability to think about critically the subject matter that you are introduced to. And they'll give you reading lists, significant reading lists of primary source or secondary source material, not textbooks. University programs that rely on textbooks are, in my view, not really doing the work that needs to be done.
100%.
But this is, one of the challenges of the university system now is that it is harder and harder to find universities that will actually discipline you, will actually put you through the habitus of a discipline or a group of disciplines. At Cambridge, we have HSP, PS, Human, Social, and Political Sciences. At Oxford, they have PPE, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics degrees where you do several different disciplines at once. You try several of them out. You see which one is the one that is best for you. And then this allows you to make a real decision about which one you ultimately would like to pursue. So you get a little bit of an exposure to how, say, anthropologists grade your papers, and you get a little bit of exposure to how politics people grade, and a little bit of exposure to how, you're marked in the feedback that you get from sociologists, or maybe historians if it's history and politics, or maybe psychology, or maybe archaeology. There's a number of these different disciplines that get paired up in these programs. And the function of it is to give you the maximum possible chance to find one of these that really is a good spot for you. Because many people who are good fits for one of these will be terrible fits for one of the others. I once knew a student who got terrible marks on his archaeology papers, but came top of the year in politics. And it was just a question of the archaeologists and the politics people had very different methodological approaches, and the way that he thought and write fit politics much better than archaeology. You wouldn't have a chance to discover that if you just went and you tried to study archaeology because you thought that was what you were supposed to be doing. So some of the being able to hop around and try different disciplines out, this can be functional, but only if the introductory courses actually habituate you to the methods and standards of the disciplines. If they give you multiple choice tests and true, false, and little, are you paying attention, reading comprehension exercises like they do in high school, you won't actually get exposed to the discipline, so you won't actually discover whether you love it. You'll be given a kind of mediated ersatz version of it that's really about testing to see if you're diligent and will show up and will perform, so that you can be given a job coupon that certifies that this is the case for you. And so it is necessary to differentiate between the job coupon factory degree and a real degree that subjects you to a real discipline.
Okay. Now, I want to tarry with this before we get to my own sort of solutions or like, attempts at doing things to counter certain tendencies that are negative in the autodidact life, especially because, Theory Underground aims to serve workers with earbuds. And in a lot of cases, I mean, well, we should assume, therefore, that in all cases, the audience here that we serve is going to feel this sort of tension, feel the contradictions that we are teasing out here. Um, and so I already took up this sort of devil's advocacy position, and then you've, basically granted that as valid, and therefore you wouldn't be recommending someone to, for instance, go to Boise State, as opposed to, you've got other kinds of programs in mind that a person could ideally get into. Now, in a lot of cases, they're not going to be able to get into it for reasons. Those reasons might be things like a criminal record. Those reasons might be something like responsibilities to children, because, maybe you had children when you were younger than ideal, or whatever. But there's going to be circumstantial reasons. But I also want to get at this thing about habitus. And so when we're psychoanalyzing, of course, you're not really psychoanalyzing, but you're talking about, well, a person has gone through some serious stuff. Well, and maybe they didn't get the recognition and or love that they needed. Uh, I want to take that to a little bit more of a socioanalytic level there. And so, with socioanalysis, we're going to talk about the field in particular that the person was navigating. When you say those things, you are doing that. You're getting at the field of the family, but the field of the school is also a thing. And working class schools are almost in all cases the reality that we're dealing with when we're talking about workers with earbuds who are getting into big ideas through the internet. If we're talking about people who come in through Joe Rogan Experience or Theo Vaughn or something like that, and they were exposed to big ideas because one of those kinds of podcasters had on some intellectuals over time, and now that person, maybe through Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris, they got more into philosophy, woohoo, or psychology and neuroscience. That person might be really into these subjects, but at the level of their habitus, they are not capable of adapting to the norms of this kind of field. And when I'm saying this kind of field, I'm talking about the school, but of course I'm talking about the working class school, as opposed to the kind of school that respects the humanity and nobility of the human, right? And so to tarry with this, though, I think what would be great is to just read off the six main functions of the school according to John Taylor Gatto in Weapons of Mass Instruction. And I think we could just take turns reading these. So I'll just share the first three here in the chat. If you'll read the first one, I'll read the second one. And kind of what I want to do with this is then kind of give you an opportunity to respond to this, because ultimately, if the working class school is filtering for a certain type of person, the kind of person being spat out or filtered out of that system, to really understand where a lot of us are coming from, I think requires really thinking about these six functions. Okay.
All right. So 1, the adjustive or adaptive function. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. This, of course, precludes critical judgment completely. It also pretty much destroys the idea that useful or interesting material should be taught, because you can't test for reflexive obedience until you know whether you can make kids learn and do foolish and boring things.
And that, foolish or boring things would include, sitting in a chair for the majority of your most formative years, staring in one direction, competing to have some kind of identity vis-a-vis the, authority figure in that room, right? There's all this, invisible syllabus stuff going on in that dynamic that he's getting at.
Yeah, I
Two,
vibe with this. I found high school incredibly boring. Incredibly boring. I used to just draw pictures in a notebook all through high school. Uh, I was able to perform anyway, but not because I paid attention in class. Uh,
okay.
so I very much vibe with that.
Two, the integrating function. This might well be called the conformity function because its intention is to make children as alike as possible. People who conform are predictable, and this is of great use to those who wish to harness and manipulate a large labor force. So, John Taylor Gatto is a libertarian, but he obviously is a lot more labor history pilled than most libertarians ever have been. And so the whole text is framed through the fact that giant corporations want a particular kind of worker, and that has shaped everything about the schooling system.
Yeah. The diagnostic and directive function. School is meant to determine each student's proper social role. This is done by logging evidence mathematically and anecdotally on cumulative records, as in your permanent record. Yes, you have one.
For the differentiating function, once their social role has been diagnosed, children are to be sorted by role and trained only so far as their destination in the social machine merits, and not one step further. So much for making kids their personal best.
5. The selective function. This refers not to human choice at all, but to Darwin's theory of natural selection as applied to what he called the favored races. In short, the idea is to help things along by consciously attempting to improve the breeding stock. Schools are meant to tag the unfit with poor grades, remedial placement, and other punishments clearly enough that their peers will accept them as inferior and effectively bar them from the reproductive sweepstakes. That's what all those little humiliations from first grade onward were intended to do: wash the dirt down the drain.
And then finally, number 6, the propedeutic function. The societal system implied by these rules will require an elite group of caretakers. To that end, a small fraction of the kids will quietly be taught how to manage this continuing project, how to watch over and control a population deliberately dumbed down and declawed in order that government might proceed unchallenged and corporations might never want for obedient labor.
Whew. Well, it's not like I'm going to really argue against a lot of that. I went to a public high school in Northwest Indiana, and there were some good teachers there, but of course, there was a ton of this stuff. And I know that the students who were not in the honors classes got it worse than we did in many regards, in all of these categories.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
was in classes with the non-honor students on occasion, and I saw how the teachers who were regularly in the habit of teaching non-honor students had to interact with them or felt they had to interact with them. And yes, I recognize a lot of this in a lot of the worst instances. You also do have a lot of teachers these days who are underpaid, undertrained, to be able to give the kind of education that kids really deserve. And that's a structural problem to do with how much they're paid, and also to do with the content of the education degree, the content of the teaching degree taught at the universities, and the managerial stuff that those teachers are picking up, which often is not the most helpful stuff. Of course, the thing to remember when you're going through a process like this is that that process could not, of course, produce the intellectuals that you have found compelling in your life. If you've listened and you've heard intellectuals who are genuinely captivating, that process could not have produced them. Some other process must exist which does produce them.
Mm-hmm.
For reasons to do with your situation, you've been cut off from that process so that you cannot be produced in that way. The question is there a way that you could not be cut off from that process? So if we reduce this to go back to the university, then of course I have to say things like, well, many universities are just a continuation of the schooling system. They are. Many degrees are just a continuation of this. Of course they are. So I couldn't recommend that you go and do those things. That wouldn't turn you into the kind of person that you'd want to be. In my own case, I know that I myself avoided a lot of those universities when I was making the decision about where to go to school precisely for that reason. So I'm not going to talk down to you and go, well, yes, I went to good universities, but you should go to some place that's going to machine you for 3 or 4 years. That wouldn't be at all fair to you, and it wouldn't make you into somebody like me. It wouldn't actually cause you to become the kind of person that you might be looking to become. So it would be completely unhelpful, except for the purposes of perhaps skilling you for a job, which is not really what we're here to talk about. So then part of the question with Theory Underground is there some other mechanism by which this could be done that would be more accessible, that would not require that you cough up this enormous amount of money, that would not require that you put your life on hold or move to some faraway destination? Is there some other way that you could be disciplined and actually get the thing that you've been cut off from? And that is what I take this experiment to really be about. We're interested in, are there people out there who want to be disciplined, who maybe can't get access to the elite universities that produced the academics that you found really compelling, the intellectuals that you found really compelling, but who have a potential and might, if they're able to submit to a discipline and adopt a habitus, actually pick up a lot of the capacities and skills that are thought to be impossible for them. And it's really a question of institution building. Can we make a structure, can we make a system outside of the university system that performs the real function that universities are meant to perform, and performs this for people who typically would not really have access to that? And the way that this was dealt with in the 20th century was just by admitting more and more people to the university system, and then dumbing down and turning the university system into an extension of high school so as to accommodate those people, to give them an ersatz of university education without the real thing. And then once they think they have it, and this is where you get the real bureaucratic person. You come out of high school, you don't go to college, you know that you haven't been. The people who went, but went to fake universities that are extensions of high school, think that they have a real education. And they go around and boss everybody around and act like they're experts. And they give the disciplines a bad name in doing this. We have to not let those people cause us to not love what we love. We have to nonetheless pursue with devotion the things that we love and find a way to do that in a rigorous way, together in community. And we need a structure that facilitates that. And if the university system won't give us that structure, then we have to come together socially and make it ourselves.
Yeah, and it feels like um, a tall order, a tall order. You know, it feels like we're not just swimming upstream. Like what we're trying to do is impossible in a lot of ways, because what we are experiencing um I mean, there's this libidinal side, this sort of socioanalytic side that we've been getting at already, but there's also just the actual uh the burnout of people who don't have their time energy trying to do something that has to be done from a space of skole, right? And your time energy can either be labor power on call for the economy, or it can become something like skole or otium, right? It can become this kind of creative, active leisure place from which you can dive in the deep end with subject matters. But being able to do that, if you look at the way that someone like a Nietzsche or a Heidegger was being schooled, in a country that believed in Bildung, in the cultivation of its humans, especially its best. They were doing 3 to 4 hour sessions on any given subject matter. Like the day, and Nietzsche started that at the age of 10, right? Like at the age of 10, they sent him in his little trousers and hat off to a boarding school that was like the premier boarding school in the world. Like there was no better place that he could have been to learn the things that he was learning. And he started it at the age of 10. It's insane to think about. Um, but like this wasn't like oh, you're sitting in one class for 50 minutes and now you're rushing down the hall to the next class for 50 minutes, and then you know what I mean? Like it was instead like you actually get to spend time with these charismatic masters, and
Yeah.
that's
The
what we're
faint
swimming
memory of
upstream
this is
against.
why Harry Potter became such a big thing. You know, that idea that you're 11 years old and you get taken out of the mundane, not a real school and put into a place where you learn spells that do real stuff, you know,
Yeah.
something real that actually, you know, the fantasy that the children have that they might actually get a real education.
Yeah, and also the Sorting Hat gets it right
Yeah.
almost every time.
Puts you
That's
where
the
you
thing.
actually belong. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's an inherent just like in Plato's sense, this is justice. Like people are actually being sorted where they go. Whereas
Yeah.
few people feel
Circumscribed
that
by the
today.
horizon of what they've been exposed to. But of course, it's based on British boarding schools. That's the
Right.
basis for that, and all of the bullying and abuse too that occurs.
Right. And so, there's the idea that those intellectuals you find inspiring did not get subjected to this kind of process that John Taylor Gatto is outlining
Or if
with
they
these
did, they
six
worked through
functions,
it. Because you
or they
can. Some of us did. Some of us were able to. We saw that this stuff was going on, and we found ways around it. In my own case, when I was in high school, I adopted, a mantra with regard to the schoolwork. If I stopped caring long ago, I'm not going to care about this stuff that isn't important. What I'm going to do is find a way to get out of here and go do what I actually want to do. And I'm going to spend all of the time while I'm in high school preparing to go and do that thing. I'm going to read what I think I should be reading, and I'm going to do the absolute bare minimum for these people to get them to leave me alone. And that was my strategy. I went, okay, if I go to the UK, then my grade point average doesn't have to be higher than a 3.0. I can blow off lots of stuff and it'll be fine as long as I test well. So I'll prep for these tests. I'll get high scores on these tests. I can do that. I'm good at taking tests. And I'll ignore the work that I don't want to do. And then, I can go through, do this undergraduate degree in just 3 years and get on my way to doing what it is that I actually want to do. Gave myself
mm,
my own reading list over the summer and set about doing it. Uh, because I recognized that it had become completely just busy work, just busy work. I was at a stage where 80% of the homework I was doing was math homework. Nobody assigned any papers on anything apart from, novels or poetry. There was no, reading theory, reading philosophy, reading real history books. It was all textbooks and trivia. It was You had all of these sports coaches, pretending to be teachers, but really they were just interested in coaching the sports teams. So I had
wait,
this
really?
experience. Yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In science and social studies, the bulk of the teachers are there really to coach a sports team. Their fantasy is to continue to be in high school sports. So what they really want to do is coach football or volleyball or track or whatever. And they teach science or they teach social studies so that they have something to do. It's
What?
not just PE teachers, it's also science and
I did.
social studies teachers at a lot of these schools. Then the foreign language teachers are just whoever in the town speaks the language, who is
Oh
moved from one
no.
of these countries, who's an immigrant, will go and get skilled to teach because it's an easy thing to do. And so you don't get very good foreign language education. You don't get very good science or social studies education. The school focuses still on English and math because English and math is what really goes into the standardized tests. They have to do at least a decent job on those to score well enough on the tests. And the high school I went to was one of the better schools in the state of Indiana. It was not a really bad public school. We had many of those nearby that I encountered if I did, uh, any kind of academic competition regionally with other schools. You'd see what the other students at the other schools were doing, and generally we were better off than them. And as a consequence, whenever I would complain, they would say, "You should just be lucky that you go to a school as good as this one and not these others." So, my
Yeah.
and I, yeah, I'm perfectly aware of the limitations of all of this. What I was able to do was to think long term because I was well loved at home. I was able to think in a much more long-term way and to engage with the concept of deferred gratification, which a lot of people are not able to do when they get plunged into this situation. They find that they have to immediately react and rebel to what is happening instead of going, okay, if I immediately react and rebel, what's going to happen? They're just going to put me in a situation where I'm going to have no control over my life. What happens to the people who get removed from the honors classes? They just have less power and control. They're treated with less respect. They're further immiserated. What do the people in the remedial classes who don't go to college, what happens to them? What do they end up doing in life? They just end up getting told what to do all the time by everybody. The more you rebel, the more you will be subordinated. So what you do is you don't rebel in any way that will actually cause you trouble. And then you do rebel in the ways that will liberate you, free you, and allow you to do something else. And you are discerning about where and when and how. In classes, I used to talk exactly as much as I thought the teacher would let me get away with, and I'd calibrate it. So if a teacher would allow me to interject, interrupt, and make jokes to, feel better about my life, I would do that exactly as much as I could without getting in trouble. That's the ticket. But a lot of people, they're not able to calibrate that, or they
No,
don't
they're
have
not.
the
No.
discipline to be able to judge. So that's what got me through it. It's not that I don't know this system. It's that and it's because of how I was raised and brought up and the family situation I had, I was able to think through it and make a plan for extricating myself from it
Well,
and recruit
you
my
were
parents into supporting that plan.
you were also reading The Week as a 7-year-old, right? So you there was this thing about you that was like you were like an old soul in a little body, and you were like from the outset going pretty hard in a way that I think just a lot of people don't even think to try to study that kind of stuff until they're probably in their mid-teen, probably 17, 16 years old. Like it might occur to them. And at that point, it's like for some reason you were doing it out the door. And I don't imagine that uh,
Yeah, I loved
I don't even
a
think that
subject.
probably wasn't even normal of your peers at Cambridge, right? Like that, this is just a special thing,
Yeah,
you know?
a lot of people, they have to figure out what it is that they love or if they love something. A lot of people, when they go to uni, they don't know yet if they love a subject and they have to figure that out. I knew very early in life what it was that I loved and was able to plan my life around that because it became really, really evident to me. But yes, other people typically don't know if they love a subject, whether they love a subject, and it takes longer to figure it out. A lot of people's parents don't encourage that. They think that
Mm.
that is unhelpful. They want their kid to be more pragmatic, and they emphasize pragmatism more throughout the upbringing, which makes it harder to just get absorbed devotionally in a particular interest.
Yeah, this is actually something Anne and I both have found concerning in our time uh, traveling uh, and meeting people and just becoming more observant of how people parent. Whether we're talking people who homeschool their children or people whose children are in a more sort of mainstream K through 12 institution, what we've seen is a sort of parental fear of childhood obsession. And really, obsession is just a slightly negative connotation. We could easily turn positive by calling it devotion, right? And so what we're talking about is like there's a sort of parental fear that the child is going to prioritize a subject matter for more than an hour. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
Sometimes it's a
you
phase and you come out of it. I had a couple of phases before I found the thing. When I was
right,
really little, I liked dinosaurs, and then I liked, basketball, and then I found politics. I went from it was trains, dinosaurs, basketball, then politics. And it was, big, powerful things. And how do they work? That was
right.
the thing that was running through it. That was what I was captivated by. And I eventually, found my thing. But
So
yeah,
so
a
so
lot of
so it's just
parents,
it's
one of
not
the
just
things that,
love. Sorry, it's not just love then in the sense of like, oh, you are seen, you are cared for, but it's also there is this higher level here that we're talking about where the parent isn't getting in the way of your devotion to a subject matter, which is to also say it allowing you to dive into a phase,
oh
empowering
yeah,
you.
my parents, it didn't care if I stayed in any of these phases. And they certainly didn't care about a lot of the things that I focused on. My parents were not obsessed with politics. They weren't obsessed with any of the things that I got absorbed with. I had to get them interested in the things that I wanted to do. But they were open to at least permitting me to explore interests. They didn't prefigure what it is that I had to do or what it is that I had to focus on. The thing that drove me nuts is that when I was in high school, there were other kids whose parents were richer than my parents who could not think the way that I thought about stuff because their parents would insist upon a pragmatic approach. So they would say, you have to go to the cheapest school or the school where you have the most scholarship money. You have to study a subject which seems obviously tied into a straightforward career possibility. And so I'm looking at these kids and I'm going, you're, not, you know, stupid. Your parents have more money than my parents. You could, in principle, do all kinds of stuff, but you're just going along with your parents insisting on you doing this thing that's going to lead you to having a very limited life. Uh, and maybe this has been the thing that differentiated me. I have always been able to think in terms of if you make this life choice, what kind of life will you then end up living? And will that life be justifiable or worth embarking upon? So to me, certain decisions that you make, once you make them, they're just going to put you on a limiting track that's going to very
Right.
much shape who you can be, what you can become. And you might still be able to get off that track, but the further down you go, the harder it is to get off. And the more the off ramps will just be extensions in disguise. So
Right.
for me, it's always been don't make these kinds of mistakes, don't learn the hard way, be able to see where it goes. Look at the people who make these kinds of decisions and the ways that they live and decide whether you want to end up living the way that they live. So you look at the people who do what they're told and the white collar middle management jobs that they end up with in the conventional professions, the lawyers, the doctors, the engineers. You look at the life that they're having. Is that what you want? Is that who you want to be? To me, it was clear that I did not want that kind of life. I did not want to be a lawyer. A lot of people thought, oh, I'm into politics. I must eventually be a lawyer. No,
Right.
I did not want to be a lawyer. I looked at the way lawyers lived. I looked at their habitus, the way they talked, the kind of ethics or morality that they tended to espouse as a consequence of the way that they lived. And I don't want to be one of these people. That's not to say that every lawyer is a terrible person. But you do have to
No.
be able to engage in certain heuristics. When you start to go, well, I'll be the special lawyer who's not like the rest, this becomes the excuse that allows you to become exactly like the rest.
Right.
When you say the rules don't apply to me, I'm able to be the stoic sage and to be good no matter what the circumstances are. That's when you make the real mistakes that really, really fence you in.
Well, this way of thinking that you're saying, yeah, maybe it's unique. It was, your peers didn't seem to get this way of thinking, or they weren't applying it. I definitely
Weren't
wasn't.
permitted to develop it.
I wasn't
The
permitted
parents
to
wouldn't.
develop it, right? And I'm not sure. I'm not so sure that. See, I think I that doesn't reflect poorly on my parents. It reflects poorly on the school that they went to when they were kids, and so they weren't permitted either. And so what we're talking about is being, being being what we are, finding ourselves where we are when we do, and then saying, okay, well, now what? Right? I know that I have like this interest, potentially passion for the life of the mind. Because of structural things, I am foreclosed on my horizon of possibilities from, say, going to Cambridge. So then what? And then obviously we were saying, well, then Theory Underground is an attempt. It's an attempt to say that there's still something that you can do while being a working person. You should be able to, if you really want to do this, and let's just say, for the cost of the average gamer lifestyle, you could be uh, equipping yourself with all of the kinds of things that we're teaching here for our subscribers, right? Uh, well, I guess we don't have to solve all the world's problems or really pave a way forward right now, but I do want to give people a sense for what we've tried that hasn't worked and kind of the direction we're going to try to take things here soon. But I guess I don't know. I know we have to close out pretty soon, and so we can kind of just hit on some of the main stuff that comes to mind because I think I wouldn't put it past how to say this. I'm sure a lot of people who've listened to this so far just feel like despairing, right? Because it's a kind of a dark situation, and if you're not especially blessed uh, with wisdom at an early age, you find yourself having made a lot of decisions where the scope of what you can do is narrowed, and the off ramps are really not. It's just more of the same thing in disguise, and so a lot of people are in that sort of loop. And so I guess we could start out with what advice immediately you have. And I would just say the part that is so depressing is that you weren't able to give me that advice when I was 7 years old. You know, Benjamin, you would have been a much better friend. Um, well, look, I had the best friend in the world at the age of 7, but in particular, at the point that I was really thinking rebellious things, uh, as I was, going through puberty, I was like becoming a teenager, and the kid I fell in with, um, he wasn't able to show me much, right? How to be cool was just about the only thing that he was willing to give me a lesson in, right? Which is, the main key is, quit moving around and act like you don't care. Like, it's very basic things. But but he wasn't giving me this kind of advice about longer term ways of thinking. What you're talking about is strategic rebellion. That was not on my horizon. But I think a lot of people listening to this now, they find themselves between the ages of probably 27 and 42. Now what? Right.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we might potentially be able to do, in addition to an institution that can offer some of this, is also to give some people some advice about where they're at in the thing that they love. Yeah, maybe hard advice in some cases, honest truths, and talk about what would be the steps or stages in trying to do something else with that, and whether that's something that they are willing to undertake. Uh, what I wrestle with is that there could be several different major reasons why people are really not getting there. One can be the family environment. One can be the schooling system, the university system, the way that people have experienced that. Of course, then you've got the wider economy and the lack of resources, the cost of university, the cost of tuition, and the need to work a job that potentially interferes with what you're doing. But there's also the talent question. And one of the things that has come up in the background of discussing how I came through was the weird stuff that I did. And when I was a kid, I sometimes tended to think that the difference between me and the other kids was that I was just smarter than them and that they were stupid, and that was the explanation. Or they were bad. They just didn't try hard enough. They just didn't think hard enough about what they were doing. And as I got older, I got away from that idea. I got away from the idea that it was just a question of talent. And I started to think in terms of what are the things that I got that they didn't get that empowered me to be what I was and didn't empower them to be what they might have been. And to me, this is a major kind of, since we're doing why left-right question. A major left-right question is there just a very small part of the population that's like Benjamin by nature, and that part can do things that other people can't do, in which case you then start to rationalize this whole system as a way of sorting out the me's from everybody else? Or is there actually a potential in people that is crushed out of them over time, but if you intervene before it's completely crushed out, might yet be discovered and developed? In which case, if we're not discovering and developing that, there could be stuff that we could do in terms of organizing, in terms of institution building, that could unlock some of that stuff. And this belief that there's more potential, more possibility there than has been heretofore acknowledged, and that there is something we could do to tap it, despite the various obstacles to tapping it. That fundamental belief in the people who are listening that they might be able to really get the benefit of something if it's structured in such a way that it's accessible to them and doesn't treat them like an invalid or like an inferior or like somebody who can't think, which so much of the existing system does. So much of the existing system treats people like objects to be constructed in one way or another way, to be imprinted on a particular dogma, particular ideology or set of ideas, certain concepts, certain definitions imposed. Can we not do that? Is it possible to teach people in a way that empowers them to think rather than giving them a framework that they then are stuck in? And so much of the university system in the United States is giving people frameworks that they're then stuck in, that they think are right or correct, but which are only appropriate if they're appropriate at all to a very limited context. Can we do something that goes beyond that? This is what I think we are exploring and trying to explore. And it might be that we can't figure out how to do that in this situation for reasons that are to do with the situation that we're in. But even if that were the case, I would not give up on the idea that there wouldn't be some way. And this is the devotion that I ultimately still have to all the people I remember from high school who were in there with me and who, for various reasons, were not ending up where I felt they could have been. There's so many people that I went to school with who, if they had gone to a great university, they would have been okay. They would have, maybe they wouldn't have finished at the top of the class or whatever, but they could have hacked it. I taught students at Cambridge. I went to high school, a public high school in the United States. There were a lot of people who could have figured it out if they were put in an environment that had demanded that from them and challenged them in that way. But then that never happens. You end up in a different kind of life. You get used to different kind of habits. And these capacities, they atrophy. You lose them insofar as you had them. They're not developed. And it becomes easy to forget that they were ever there. And then you yourself even forget that they're there. You yourself even come to believe that you don't have them. And you're talked into this idea that some people are just geniuses and you're not. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that, even though I've lived a life that could make you think that. But I still don't. And it's because I still don't that I'm still wanting to try to make something. Otherwise, I could just do what everybody else does and go, well, let me go and get whatever I can with my intellect and leave everybody else behind.
Right. And if that's an especially left impulse, oh, by the way, yes, there's a puppy now. This is Daisy. She's wet and cold, and so I'm warming her with a towel. But daddy's babysitting time. Anyway, the impulse there that environment is more important than, say, genetics, just as a sort of basic approach, right? Because you'll get people who try to say, oh, no, well, what you have is differences in IQs across populations, that these are based in genetics, and that's just the way of it. Versus, the more standard progressive, well, it's environment and education is going to be the solution to things. Well, then I'm definitely going to be more left or progressive by those standards. I think that there's a lot of merit to that approach. I also think to some extent, though, that we're going to have to be realists about the situation. And so that means a lot of people, maybe you feel like you could have been the next Nietzsche or Heidegger, but you're not gonna be. I'm sorry, you didn't go to that prestigious school at the age of 10 during a historical period when writing the way that he was writing could have made that kind of a difference. Like to be a realist means what I'm getting at is like letting go of for a lot of autodidacts. I think there's going to be sort of formative fantasies, and that you're going to want to deconstruct those fantasies so that you have more realistic expectations, right? And so for me, what that means is like going, no, it's too late for me. I've been very, very serious about well, what would it take for me to actually be fluent enough in Greek or German to be able to read some of my favorite philosophical texts in the original, it's at least 2 hours a day, to get there within 4 years. It would be like 2 hours a day of like serious study. And I'm already at a point where it's like I don't have time to do a lot of the basic things that I should be doing. Uh, and I'm 37. It's just like this. It is too late for me in a sort of sense. And I'm not even trying to be the next Nietzsche or Heidegger or Marx or what have you, but I want to be able to at least read these things in their primary language. And I do want to see what I can do, having been a late sort of bloomer, right? So what I am still thinking, well, I want to see what I can do, right, more realistically. But also part of this realizing I don't need to be the person who has it all figured out, though. I think this isn't something I realized in the last 6 months or something. No, this is something I've known for years. And Theory Underground is in part a realization that comes from this disillusionment with that sort of fantasy I think I had in my undergrad of like, oh, I could be a great thinker. Uh, it's like, well, if I can make some kind of a contribution, then great. But one way to make that contribution is to stop, and this brings us back to the idea of trying to influence the Zoomers, like we talked about in part one. Um, Stop thinking that to have an impact or legitimate influence, you have to be thinking about the next generation. For me, it's realizing, oh, I can just spend 20 years preparing myself to have something worth saying to a different generation, right? Like I can buy myself that additional time. And part of how I can do that and actually stay on task is by becoming a parent and actually being very involved in the education of my children, which gives me that opportunity to, for instance, study a language like Greek, right? And it makes it so it's not just for me in my solitude. It's actually me giving it forward to somebody else who can then go on and hopefully do something with it in a way that in a lot of ways it's too late for me. And so thinking about passing the torch and like laying the conditions for future generations and being a smaller part in a much bigger thing, I think not only is it more realistic, but it's also more noble. So it's more realistic and it's more noble. And so that gets me out of this idea that I need to be that lone thinker who's going to get it done, right?
Yeah, you don't have to make the perfect the enemy of the good. So many people make the perfect the enemy of the good, and then they do something bad instead of something that would have been decent. Well, I can't be perfect, so I won't even try. I won't be decent.
Now, in our last like 5 minutes, this was supposed to segue into the whole idea that we're going to churches now. At Theory Underground. Now, I say we, I mean whoever's involved in phase 2 of Sarutu. I mentioned Sarutu at the beginning of this episode. That stands for Socioanalysis and Alien Anthropology Research Unit at Theory Underground. It's all proto research or deconstructive research. We're not trying to make IRB approved claims to generalizable knowledge. We're not doing that. We're just taking our own assumptions to task. And so we did that with an instrument that was used on students at my university, faculty and administration at my university, compared that across the country from the tour. But Sarutu Phase 2 is about going even further. Now, instead of doing this sort of PMC versus working class assumptions thing that the Sarutu Phase 1 instrument was getting at, which was really about the three crises: the crisis of academia, the crisis of activism, the crisis of the attention economy, the three A's. That instrument was honing in on that. This is a lot less instrumentalized. I mean, in the double sense, we don't have an instrument, and it's really just a sort of cursory, like, what will happen if we do this? What will happen if we go places where we know for an absolute fact we disagree, probably on a ton of things that a lot of people would say are absolutely important, and then spending a lot of time around other people who just disagree. And more importantly, not so that we can pose as their betters, or oh, we're so much smarter than you are, but instead learning from actually existing communities that meet on a regular basis, and in doing so, um, aren't caught up in the niches of the post-class fractured mass in this sort of way where it's all decontextualized individuals, decontextualized consumer tourist individualism. No, it's a kind of intergenerational community, um, and we probably disagree with that intergenerational community. Well, where can you even find something like that? It turns out, I'm pretty sure the only place that you can reliably find that in any town or city in the United States or anywhere else in the world is at a church. And then, of course, we could say a synagogue or a temple, but there's got to be some kind of a religious institution. It seems like that's the only way you can find people who aren't segmented out in peer groups. And of course, you will get churches that primarily appeal to to senior citizens or youth, what have you. There are churches that do this sort of, generational slice of humanity approach, but most are intergenerational still. And so far, it's been quite the experience being in places where I've not felt this outside in a while. I'm quite the outsider in a lot of these spaces, and nobody's asked me, "Why are you here?" yet. Nobody's asked, like, "Well, so what are you doing here?" And nobody's like come up and be like, "Do you believe?" I didn't take communion at the Catholic Church, or whatever, because I know it goes against their rules, and I was trying to play by their rules. And no one came up and was like, "So what? So why are you here? Or what's going on?" or whatever. Maybe they will, after we've been a few times. So the plan right now is to kind of find 4 or 5 very different denominations, where we want to get to know the people there and learn from them, uh, and kind of be a part of it, even though we're outsiders, and to cycle through these on a regular basis. So like Athol Baptist Church, we're going to go once a month, right? That's my parents' church. There's like this awesome Catholic church in Sandpoint. We're going to go there once a month. Unitarian Universalist Church, we're going to go there once a month. We went to this mega church. I don't know if we'll keep going to the mega church. That was quite the experience. Um, but as far as like, why are we doing this? Part of it is just to kind of I I want to go beyond theory in combating or countering this intellectualist, misanthropic, self-important, oh, I'm so much smarter than these other people, mode that I think I spent my mid 20s through 30s caught up in, that had me ultimately just atomized and separated from any kind of real, actually existing community in the world where I lived. And it had me primarily online and in a couple of friend groups, like IRL friend groups, and then online, but no real intergenerational community. And I want to counter that. And even if most people at Theory Underground might not get involved with phase 2 of Sarutu, by modeling it, I know I'm hystericizing everybody. I'm going to make everybody think, well, shit, am I a part of an intergenerational community anywhere? And that's an important thing for people to start thinking about. And ultimately, I'll write a book about it. And I'm sure that'll have some kind of impact on people who are, like I was for the last decade, separating myself from other people because, oh, well, I believe things different than they do, so I shouldn't have to be around them. Like, I think it's a dumb thing that we get caught up in, and I want to counter it.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to think less in terms of, do I agree with this? And are these people trying to control me? And just see what you can learn from people who have found a way to organize on the basis of something other than obvious pragmatism. Not a workplace, not to do with getting a job, not to do with being prepared to make a contribution to the economy, something that many people are able to do without while contributing to the economy. And how does it work? Rather than, am I willing to be part of it? So many people in the States in particular, I think, grew up feeling like religious institutions are something that are trying to get a hold of them, and they have to fend this off. And this attitude of fending off becomes limiting in terms of the thinking at later stages in life. Might well be the case that the particular organization that you dealt with as a kid did need to be fended off. Maybe your parents did try to impose it on you in a way that was stultifying, and you did have to fend it off. But then when you're an adult, you don't have to have that same attitude. You don't have to carry that with you all the way into adulthood. You can approach it in a different way and learn other things.
Yeah, and that's one of the things Anne and I are realizing is that we have carried that into adulthood in ways we weren't even aware of because we're trying to be like anthropologists in these spaces, but instead we're very American. We come out of these spaces very American. I'm more American coming out of a church than I was going in, at least at the level of like, you know, I'm more consciously invested in these things than I thought I was. You know what I mean? Like
Mm.
I'm just like profoundly thrown by how much people care about belief. Like or the persecution complex that people have about belief. Like they are themselves being martyred, in the Congo. We were at this church service and they're talking about 70 people, Christians, who are just burnt, killed with machetes because they're Christians. They wouldn't renounce their faith. But they're talking about it like they themselves are actively being persecuted like that. And it's like, guys are in Idaho. Like you're not, you know, but look at what I'm doing. I'm not being an anthropologist in my attitude here, am I? I'm very much
No, you
like,
sound like an American.
I sound like an American, right? And so it's
Right.
making me, it's making me realize, well, maybe the PCFM thesis is more of like an internet thing, and what if you just go and actually be around people again, you will realize like no, like you're you still share a culture here, like I am still in some way like this kind of dispositionally liberal person, even though at the level of uh propositions I probably disagree with a lot of liberals about a lot of things. I still have the habitus of that 1990s or early
Yeah.
2000s liberal.
Part of what made a difference for me on this stuff was going to Europe and seeing what that stuff looks like in Europe and going, oh, this is what they're scared of. They're scared that it will become like this. Okay. They're scared that the social norms and the church attendance rates and the attitude to religion, it will become like what it is in Europe. I understand now what it is that they're worried about. I get it. I understand what it is that has them so concerned about losing the culture war, why they think that they might lose, and what they think losing might look like. I get it. Similar kind of thing with the universities. Going to those British universities helped me see a different possibility. And that is, if there's a benefit to travel, that's the benefit. The benefit is to see that there's some other set of ways that things could be done. And once you see that concretely in a couple of different areas of life, you then become more able to imagine it in places where you would have struggled to imagine it before. When you go, oh, it actually is possible for people to live with this kind of difference in attitude and with this level of difference in structure, you go, oh, okay. So things can become something else. And there's still some level of possibility, despite all of the homogenizing effects of capitalism, for some level of variation. Okay. So they're trying to struggle within that small box of variation. And to them, that box is meaningful because this is the outcome of losing the cultural struggle within that box. And so to me, it's a small box. It doesn't take into account a lot of the things that I think are important. But I do understand that it is a box. There is a range of differences in terms of how religion can be taken up. And it's understandable that people in the United States would become concerned about ending up with a European style religious scene and that they would do dramatic things to try to prevent this. And that these
Mm,
dramatic things, anytime anybody feels embattled, anytime any religious group feels embattled, it gets more dogmatic. So if they
right,
feel
right.
embattled, then they're going to get more dogmatic. Then that's going to make what their version of religion less compelling to me. In Europe, where they've straightforwardly lost, they're not so fussed about it because there they have a way of existing in the secular society in a way that is more committed to keeping alive older stuff.
Mm,
So there it becomes, and from an American point of view, it becomes not really a totally living tradition. It becomes a little bit too much of a museum of theology. But exposure to that museum of theology helped me to see that there was a much wider variety of ways in which this stuff could be taken up than you typically see in the United States.
I just got finished with G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, and earlier in the month I'd read his The Everlasting Man. And he's when he writes those books, he's an Anglican, or whatever you say, the Church of England, and so Anglican, right? And so
Anglican, yeah.
it's it's very different. I think a lot of people who come from U.S. evangelical, I can't even use words right now, but people who come from the U.S. sort of fundamentalist approach will like a lot of what he's saying, but also they won't like a lot of what he's saying. He is very different from
Well, G.K.
their
Chesterton is
style.
a Catholic.
He became a Catholic later,
Yeah,
like much later.
yeah.
When he
He
wrote
became, yeah,
Orthodoxy, he was it was yeah.
yeah. He's I would classify him as in the Catholic tradition. The way he thinks is much more straightforwardly Catholic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and apparently he wrote a book about his conversion to Catholicism later.
Yeah.
Um, but I think guys like him and guys like C.S. Lewis, they have this profound impact on Christians in the US, but then Christians in the US, if they actually paid attention to what they're saying, would realize that their approach is very different. Their approach to belief or truth claims is very different from this sort of embattled, dogmatic, uh, weirdly like marketing focused approach. And that's the thing that gets me with the Baptist approach. It is like a multi-level marketing approach to religion. It's their approach is conversion focused, and it doesn't actually boost their retention, or sorry, it doesn't actually boost how many people they bring in, but it might boost their retention because it keeps them feeling very self-certain and tight-knit.
Yeah, these are competitive strategies that are pragmatic in character and therefore contradict the true purpose of religion. But in the United States, where we have a marketplace for religion, that is necessarily the form that it tends to take.
Yeah.
And this has been true throughout American history. Because religion is dealt with entirely in a kind of liberal marketplace, even in its attempts to resist the liberal marketplace, it becomes more liberal and more market oriented.
All right, I gotta go. We better close this out. Everybody, thank you so much, Benjamin. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Looking forward to the conversation we're going to have later this week about Machiavelli. All right, take care.
Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, from Chris Catrone to Michael Downs, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. Not to become a little online hater who just uses theory to manipulate other people and confirm your biases. No, Theory Underground is something else. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today. Thank you.